Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another brand new episode of KerVAM, a Doctor Who podcast where, of course, you should know by now, but where we talk about Doctor Who, special features, Blu-rays, the documentaries, everything about Doctor Who except the episodes in many ways. And today, of course, we're going to be covering off seasons 10 and 18 as we continue our sort of run through seasons of the collection that we didn't cover because we weren't a podcast at the time, but that, you know, it's a great opportunity with the re-releases of these seasons to be able to go and look back and discuss what was done so well and then what wasn't so well, and also actually having the opportunity to be able to buy these releases now, whereas, you know, previously they were limited edition and then gone forever, but now with these re-releases, you out there, whoever you are listening, you can pick it up. So hopefully it'll be an enjoyable chat to discuss both of these seasons today and all the documentaries and special features around them. But of course, Ryan and Charlie, we're recording this on Sunday evening, hopefully the day before it goes up, and we've just had some, you know, a fair amount of Doctor Who Series 13 news, and, you know, although we focus on special features, the VAM and all that, we are still a Doctor Who podcast, so we will talk about what is going on in the world of Doctor Who. So, Ryan, we heard some news about Doctor Who this evening. Well, firstly, let me ask you, the trailer. Did you enjoy the trailer? Did you get anything from the trailer? Was it just a few random shots of the cast, or was it actually an entertaining and interesting trailer?
It was just a few random shots of the cast. If I'm going to be honest, it didn't excite me at all, if I'm going to be brutally honest. I mean, I really wanted to get excited about it, but I just didn't have any reaction to it, nor has this really got me excited to watch Series 13, frankly.
Yeah, no, it's fair to say that wasn't the trailer to really get the fans excited. It didn't have a load of monsters in it. It didn't really give away anything. And so I think it was hard to get excited based on that, but I do also feel like that's what the Christian Malera has been about in terms of marketing quite often. So, Charlie, we've also, of course, heard the quite, significant news today that, and I'm sure we'll have more of a discussion about this, the fact that the Series 13 is going to be one single story. Like, we think it's going to be 8 episodes, maybe 7, maybe 8, something like that. But that there's going to be one story that's played out over however many episodes there are. Do you fundamentally think that's a good idea or not?
I think it's a brilliant idea, to be honest. I think Doctor Who has been making seasons every 18 months or so recently, like it's still 2005, and it feels a bit stale, especially with the Chibnall era. So I think doing that kind of story, which is kind of how programs are made now, it would allow things to be shaken up a bit and hopefully sort of reinvigorate Doctor Who, because obviously ratings are falling, viewing figures are falling. People think it's going to get cancelled in the next couple of years, so hopefully this will sort of reboot the show in a way, a sort of a soft reboot.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a great opportunity to do something different with the program. As you mentioned, it's like they've been trying to do the 2005 series 12 times over so far, and they finally realised, actually, let's try something completely different. Try something that's actually just more in line with what television in 2021 is fundamentally like, in that most series, a story lasts for a whole season. You look at Line of Duty or shows like that, it's very much about it being all one continuous story, not individual stories. So I personally also think it's a good idea, and I think it will really give the show the extra energy and boost it needs for a series that could, become a bit same old potentially. But Ryan, what did you think about this quite significant announcement?
I think it's an interesting idea. The idea of doing a season-long story arc. I think it is definitely a bold idea. My only concern is whether or not that's going to be enough to pull me back into the show after my excitement kind of got tarnished thanks to the Timeless Children, which just sort of soured my enthusiasm. And I only watched Revolution of the Daleks, basically forced myself to watch it just to see how Graham and Ryan left the show, because I was wanting to know how they left the show, how their story was going to get wrapped up. And so I only watched it purely for that. And then after that, I just felt like I was kind of done with the show, frankly. And the idea of a season-long story arc, it does sound interesting, but I'm not sure if that or getting Grey Worm from Game of Thrones is going to be enough to pull me back in.
Yeah, as someone who isn't really a Game of Thrones fan and doesn't really tend to watch it, I was obviously a bit stumped by the guests, very special, exciting, super exciting guest that was somebody I'd never really heard of. or thought was of any significance to Doctor Who. I kind of felt it was going to be somebody a little bit more important than that, or somebody we actually recognised. So I wouldn't exactly say he was, a selling point to the series for me. I don't know, were you guys a little bit underwhelmed by the fact it wasn't, the return of Catherine Tate or, I don't know, David Tennant or somebody like that it seemed to be billing it to be?
Yeah, I was
I mean,
very underwhelmed because of it, because like I didn't really realize at the time that he was the special guest. I saw the trailer and then I looked online like, oh, hang on a minute, they were going to announce a special guest. Who is it? I looked online and it was him. I just thought, oh, that's a bit underwhelming. I don't even know who this guy is. I was hoping for, I don't know, Nicholas Briggs or Catherine Tate or Billy Piper maybe, but yeah, I suppose it'll be okay.
I mean, I do like Jacob Anderson. I do think he is a solid enough actor. I mean, of course, he was good as Grey Worm in Game of Thrones, and I've seen him in a couple of movies, and I do think he is good, but I just don't know if his announcement, again, is enough to kind of get me overly excited about Series 13.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I knew him from was his role in the first series of Broadchurch, because, of course, 90% of actors that have turned up in Chris Chibnall Who were previously in Broadchurch. What a surprise. And he had, a fairly small role in the first series of that, and that was all I was aware of him. I don't think it's going to be one of those where, it really brings in an audience at all. I feel like that's what they went for example, Maisie Williams in Series 9. And I thought maybe that worked to an extent, but I don't feel like he's quite the same kind of, caliber, like seen as significant an actor to really have that impact. But you never know, his character might be really interesting. We'll really like it. I guess we'll just have to wait and find out from that point of view. But that's pretty much the news we got for Series 13 this evening. Of course, we are a podcast that talks much more about, I guess, mainly the classic series, among other things, which is something I'm sure we can all unite in our love for, even if we don't all love the current series quite so much. The classic series is always going to be there, and it was always going to be brilliant. And of course, today we're covering 2 seasons of Classic Who in one. Maybe it's a bit ambitious and bold to try and do that, but we're going to give it a go. So we're going to start, as I decided, we're going to start with Season 18. Of course, Tom Baker's final season. I decided this would be the first one simply because it was the first release that we got back in, I think this was released in February 2019, I believe. And then Season 10 was the next release in, I think, July 2019. So it's been a little while now since they came out. And of course, Season 18 covers the sort of final act of Tom Baker after, his 7th season. So he'd been doing it for quite a long time. And it very much feels like a complete shift in dynamic of the programme of Doctor Who, really one of the biggest reboots of the show, to be perfectly honest, despite having the same cast, simply because it was the moment that John Nathan Turner took over as producer. And the show, I felt watching it, having done a marathon through from, watching the Graham Williams era, suddenly John Nathan Turner turns on the scene, and it feels like almost a completely different programme. I don't know, Ryan, Charlie, obviously you've watched Season 18 before. Do you see it as such a significant change of direction for the show as maybe I do?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with Season 7, having gone from Season 17 to 18, it's a complete drastic shift. I mean, Season 17, with the exception of City and Death and Sharda, which were the only really 2 solid stories of that season, it was pretty much a laughable mess, entertaining mess, but it's still a mess. And they kind of ended up turning it into sort of a lightweight sort of comedy show, pretty much. And so I welcomed Season 18 like as if it was rain in the desert. It was such a complete shift. Where you have John Nathan Turner coming in along with Christopher Hamilton Bidmead, redesigning the look, feel, and sound of the show, making it much more kind of a bit more mature, delving more into hard science, taking it more seriously, giving it more of a freshness to it that felt like it was kind of lacking in the Graham Williams period, where you had stories that kind of looked tatty, like Underworld, Invasion of Time, Armageddon Factor, those kind of stories. So to come in and have it be sort of this bold new statement like Doctor Who is ready for the 80s, I think Season 18 definitely was that. Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. It certainly was a big change for the show, and probably maybe something that needed. I don't know, Charlie, would you think that Season 18 was what kind of the show needed after the, as Ryan said, the slightly laughable Season 17 at points with, how many Nymons have you seen today, and iconic moments like that from Season 17, which are great, but also awful. Do you think Season 18 was a step in the right direction?
to some extent. At the same, like I'm going to throw in a controversial opinion here. I kind of loved season 17. It was, again, the stories were a bit strange and the production values weren't amazing, but at the same time, I just find it quite fun to watch. Yeah, seeing it in a marathon context, season 18 is very jarring. And while lots of the things have improved, like it's more mature, like you said, Ryan, it goes into more hard science fiction, which I do prefer, I'd say. The stories themselves, I think they're a bit lackluster for this new change in direction. Like, the only ones I'd say I loved were State of Decay and Keeper of Traken, and the rest were passable, I suppose. But yeah, I think it got the shift in the right direction, but this new direction didn't properly get going until the Davison era, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree that as much as for me feels better than 17, I don't think that it suddenly turned a corner to its absolute best instantly. As you say, that there were good stories. I mean, I personally think that a story like Warrior's Gate is just bonkers but brilliant. It's completely, confusing and a bit nonsensical at points, but I think it's such a great, we're exploring things that only a show like Doctor Who could do. But then you just get slightly more average ones like Meglos. Full Circle, to an extent, I don't think it's particularly brilliant. And I've always felt that Logopolis is just a slightly disappointing way for Tom to say goodbye. It's not by any means a bad story, but I just don't think it's quite the sort of absolute top tier finale that he really deserved as a Doctor. I don't know. What do you think, Ryan?
I mean, I think both State of Decay and Warrior's Gate are the best of the seasons. I think State of Decay is such a great sort of blend of sci-fi and horror, and of course Terrance Dicks wrote it. So, and I feel like it was the one where Tom Baker felt like he was on top form and actually gave a lot of energy. I felt like compared to some of the other stories in the season where it felt like you can clearly tell where he's ill feeling and argumentative nature was more coming out in his performances throughout most of this season because of the fact that he was resigned to the fact that he was leaving. And Warrior's Gate, I think, is such an absolutely fascinating story. Even now, I'm still sort of blown away at the fact that they went so experimental and bold with this story. It's such an unusual story, even at the time when it was transmitted back in 1980. I'm still amazed that they managed to get away with transmitted a story like this. And I'm just such a huge fan of it. And as for Logopolis, I mean, I enjoyed it just as much as Planet of the Spiders. I think it's a solid story, but I don't think it quite reaches the heights of like the better final stories, like say War Games or Caves of Androzani or Peter Capaldi's last 3 episodes. Like, it doesn't reach that sort of high tier caliber, which I think Tom Baker kind of needed, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it was always going to be hard to do him justice in many ways, having been there for so long. And then just having that dynamic of almost the show is just starting to move along almost before he's left, because you've got that whole new production team coming in and very much wanting to kind of really pretty quickly take it in a new direction, but they've still got to kind of tick the box of getting rid of Tom as the Doctor. I guess that was always going to present some problems into the pile. But Charlie, we come on to obviously the features, the release of this box set. I know you've had more of a chance to look at some of the DVD stuff than the Blu-rays, but what was for you some of the sort of highlights of the documentaries they made back in the DVD days for these particular stories?
I'd say it was a proper feature length piece of VAM in the Logopolis DVD, which featured essentially just an interview with Peter Davison. But I think it was quite fascinating, him explaining how he'd follow in the footsteps of such a legendary Doctor. I think it must have been very daunting for him, filling these massive shoes that Tom Baker has created over his 7-year run. It must have been quite daunting, and he was just explaining how he'd handle that and adapt to it. And I think that was really interesting. And there was one for State of Decay called Leaves of Blood, which it wasn't a huge documentary. It was just sort of explaining the influences that like vampires in the media had on the what they called like the 3 Who rule or something from that story. So yeah, and there's a couple of others. Logopolis, there was one called A New Body at Last, basically a documentary just explaining the shift from Tom Baker to Peter Davison and The Watcher and all that.
Yeah, exactly. I think there was definitely some good stuff on there. I know you mentioned the Leaves of Blood documentary, which are sort of I think there was three of them grouped together in the still section on the Blu-rays. That obviously they were done for the DVDs, and I feel like there was another one. I think it called the Blood Show or something, that was a slightly bizarre feature where they went to speak to some like doctors and nurses and stuff and talked about blood and like the actual like science of blood and stuff. It felt a little bit odd and out of place, and it felt like they were really stretching and were like, we need to pad out this release. What can we come up with that's sort of vaguely connected to the story? I don't know if either of you actually watched that feature.
I watched it once when it came out back in 2009, and I barely remember it, other than the fact that it was kind of a bizarre feature to have, especially when on a Doctor Who DVD.
Yeah, exactly. It was a bit of an odd one. I feel you get a few of those, don't you, through the different eras of the DVDs. There was a few slightly more odd features, but we come to what is new and what is exciting on the season 18 box set. I noted that I sort of had a quick look through because I hadn't looked back at this for a little while as to what was actually new on there, and it felt like that there were a few new documentaries on there, but actually there was already quite a lot of content on this from the DVD range. There simply was so much stuff that was done for this release previously that actually it didn't need huge amounts adding to it, I thought. We look at like the Leisure Hive. There's a new commentary on there with Tom Baker. I don't know, Ryan, did you have a chance to listen to this commentary at all, or did you not really get round to it?
I did listen to it back when the box set first came out, and I believe it was basically with Matthew Sweet talking with Tom Baker. It was just basically like a routine chat about what Tom Baker was feeling at the time, how he felt going into the 80s, and sort of what his stance on with JNT was.
Yeah, exactly. It was a fascinating time, wasn't it, for Tom having to cope with this whole new production team that wanted to move on from him in many ways, and kind of, I'm sure for him realising after him sort of being in a seemingly irreplaceable position to suddenly be realising that he's almost being forced out of the programme. Must have been a really, really difficult situation. As we talked before, Matthew Sweet is a great guy for getting really interesting interviews out of actors and stars of the show. And so I think that a commentary like that's always going to be really interesting and worth watching. Almost maybe more as its own feature necessarily than it having to really tie into the story itself. Obviously, they'll be reacting to that, but it's much more about hearing just what Tom was thinking about at the time that obviously the program was being made, should I say. And so some of the other things, of course, you know, the standard we get behind the sofa. So Ryan, behind the sofa for season 18, any thoughts on it? Is it one of the better ones, one of the worst ones?
I don't remember much of behind the sofas. I only watched like the odd one or two when the set just came out, and I thought it was an interesting lineup. And what was definitely a good idea was that when they added K9 and Co onto the last disc of season 18, they did a whole new different behind the sofa for that specific episode with John Leeson and a couple of cast and crew from that episode, which I thought was a neat idea, and it's an idea that I hope they'll continue on if they do something like the Wilderness Years box set, have different guests from that specific transmitted story for the lineup.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's one of those great opportunities they really went full on with, I thought, K9 and Company, and bringing in, they did a new feature with Brendan, what was his name? The character's name was Brendan, wasn't it? I can't remember what the actor's name was. Who played him, and they had a little sort of interview with him. Oh, Ian Sears, that was it. A nice little interview with him discussing his role on the program. Something that for these actors and people was like a week 40 years ago, and they probably have barely even thought about it since, and suddenly we're doing it behind the sofa, we're doing documentaries about it. I just thought it was brilliant that they put so much extra effort into what was ultimately a single pilot for a show that never even happened. I thought that's brilliant. As you say, Ryan, having that extra behind the sofa with John Leeson, Sean Chapman and Gillian Marshall on it was just a great sort of extra way of doing it. And I did also have to say I enjoyed the sort of standard behind the sofas. I thought it was interesting to get Wendy Padbury's perspective on the show, because of course she was a second Doctor companion in Zoe, and I don't feel like we've really ever heard much about her perspective on different eras of the show. And it's that thing of just having her sort of clearly season 18 is very different to the Patrick Troughton era. Like it is a very different show. And so seeing her being able to compare her experiences from back then to what the show is like in season 18, along with, Janet Fielding, Sarah Sutton, who were in the later stories at least, I think that's just creates such an interesting dynamic between them as they're sharing. They did just such a different way of making Doctor Who and what the show is like. I thought that was a really great idea. And I always almost enjoy that second sofa more often than the main one, because you just get those sort of different cast members who aren't part of that season really having an opportunity to react to it.
I think these behind the sofas, I think it's better to have different, so for each season to have people who weren't in it, because if there's companions who were in it, while it is great, they don't really say a whole lot. I think it's more interesting with the ones who weren't. For example, season 24, I preferred the Colin Baker and Peter Davison sofas compared to the one with the actual cast, mostly because with the actual cast they just sort of said, oh, I remember him or her with the actor, like, oh, he was nice. But I think with the others that it's more interesting because they compare the era they're watching with the era that they were in, like you said. So I think it's better to have a nice range of other people who've been in Doctor Who but not necessarily in that era.
Yeah, you're going to get some actual critique and real comment rather than just, oh, wasn't it lovely? They were a lovely actor. It was great to work with them, which is nice, but it doesn't really add anything to what you already know. And the sort of, I guess, probably the sort of fans we are, we want to find out more information and get more perspectives on that story or that scene or that moment or something, rather than just saying, oh, it was lovely to be there. So yeah, that's definitely one of the benefits behind the sofa and having that spread of people, as you say, on season 24. They did a great job of that as well. So if we look at looking through the box set, Meg Lost was another story that didn't really have anything new on it. It already had, well, it wasn't really a making of documentary, but having the couple of writers meet with wasn't it Christopher Bidmead and have a little chat about the story was really nice to see, because I think they hadn't met each other for like 30 years since they'd done the story or something along those lines, which is always really nice. And then the usual behind the sofa and a few just little documentaries about the story and the sort of continuity and so on and so forth. But of course we then come to Full Circle, which has what I think is probably my favourite feature on this box set. And it was A Weekend with Waterhouse, which is basically something that they've done before in the Doctor Who. Well, back in the DVD range, they started this with Toby Haydock, who's a great guy, frankly, a great presenter who's a bit of a comedian, but also has such great knowledge and interest in Doctor Who that it's absolutely fantastic. And he's done this previously. I think it was with who was it? Oh, it was John Levine. That was it. John Levine. He went and spent a weekend with Living with Levine, wasn't it? It was called, back on Claws of Axos or something like that. And he basically just goes and spends a weekend living with these slightly lesser known personalities of Doctor Who, or maybe the slightly more closed off personalities of Doctor Who. And you find out that bit more about them. And so for this one, of course, Toby went and spent a weekend with Matthew Waterhouse down in Hastings, in his little flat there, I think, and sort of just basically spending a weekend with him, chatting away with him, exploring his favourite sort of spots locally and discussing his time on Doctor Who, his life since and everything. And I just found it absolutely fascinating, because I feel like Matthew Waterhouse and Adric in particular is obviously quite a maligned character in Doctor Who. I think it's fair to say he's not particularly popular. But and I think to some extent Matthew Waterhouse as an actor and a person has also kind of ended up on the wrong side of that at points, where I felt like this documentary just really gave me a much nicer, kinder perspective of him as a person. And actually he's a really wonderful person who is actually just a really big Doctor Who fan at his heart, really. And sure, he has very strong opinions and maybe thinks his character is actually a lot better than it was. I will say he likes to think he was like the greatest Doctor Who companion ever, or should have been, but for the writing and the cast alongside him, which probably isn't true. But I just found the feature itself absolutely fascinating. I mean, Ryan, I'm sure you had a chance to watch it. What did you think of Weekend with Waterhouse?
I thought it was a pretty fascinating documentary. I mean, I'm not going to lie, Adric is probably joint alongside Dodo as my least favorite companion. I just always found him. I felt like his character was kind of pointless for a lot of the stories. I did find that a lot with sometimes with season 18 and 19. His character was kind of superfluous to the story, and I just didn't feel like, I was just like, why is he even there? What is he bringing to the party? And I did feel like that a lot with State of Decay to it. Definitely, just feel like he wasn't needed. And which is a shame, because Matthew Waterhouse is a genuinely sweet guy. And I think this documentary definitely shows that. I mean, we see him in his house showing off his collection, and what really definitely made me happy was they showed off his Blu-ray collection of the Adam West Batman series, which I'm not gonna lie, I also got that series as well. So good to know there's a fellow Adam West Batman fan there. And it was just telling his stories about how he got the part and how he was just only had like one major, like only one TV role before he got involved in Doctor Who, which maybe kind of explained his sort of inexperience as an actor playing Adric. But it was a fascinating story nonetheless, and how he was a fan of the show, and how jumping onto it was kind of a little bit turbulent because of the fact that both Tom Baker and Lala Ward were very difficult people to work with for him. So the fact that he grew up with the show, seeing this Doctor as his hero, only to then turn out to be the complete opposite, with Tom Baker just being just so down, so not in a good mood throughout this season, probably because he was concerned to the fact that he was leaving and everyone wanted him to go. And so it was definitely interesting hearing Matthew's perspective on it. And I did think this was a great documentary. And there was one moment in it that made me laugh out loud, where he reveals to Toby that he wrote, I think it was a book called Sugar, about a man dressed as a donut. And I can't even say without laughing. There's a bit in it where a woman, he says there's a period where a woman falls in love with this man, but she's more like in love with the fact that he's dressed as a donut, and that sort of makes her fancy him. And Toby's reaction is just like, oh. And it was just, and that made me laugh out loud. It was just, that was definitely the highlight of what was, in short, a brilliant documentary. Absolutely.
Yeah, Matthew's definitely an interesting character. I can't say I'm going to go and rush to buy any of his books. I mean, I'm sure they're an interesting read, but I don't think I'm going to rush out to try and get it, because I'm not sure if it's really going to be something I want to look too much into. But I mean, Charlie, I know you haven't had much of a chance to watch the documentary. What's your kind of perspective on Adric as a character? Because again, he's fairly maligned, and as Ryan said, probably his least favourite companion.
I'd say he's a lot worse in season 19. I don't think he has amazing chemistry with really any of the TARDIS team, like Tegan, Nyssa, or the Fifth Doctor. But with Tom Baker and Lalla Ward, well, they didn't get on the set, obviously. I think in the stories, they're okay together. Well, right, yeah, Ryan, you were saying how he's a pointless character in season 18. He originally wasn't supposed to be in State of Decay and Warrior's Gate, so they just kind of gave him a very minor role in those two. But when it went to Keeper of Traken, then he had more major roles, which kind of made it a bit worse, I think. But yeah, Adric, he's so smart at times, he kind of overshadows K9 and eventually the Doctor, and he just comes off as more of an arrogant brat than like a mischievous sort of impish character. He doesn't come off as likable like he's supposed to be.
Yeah, it does feel like he's written as a bit of an unlikable character fundamentally, isn't he?
Yeah, I remember that in Fought to Doomsday, that he blindly sides with the baddies, thinking they're the best thing to have happened, and the Doctor, and I'm just feel like I'm the Doctor. I'm just like, will you just stop and listen? And I just feel like they didn't really have that much chemistry in season 19 with the Peter Davison lot. And frankly, I think the best character, which is why I personally feel like the best character of Davison's run, I feel like the most properly feels like a character to me, was Tegan, because she actually showed the most personality and actually, for the most part, made a lot of sensible decisions that felt real. Whereas someone like Adric, I was just like, why are you even here? And frankly, the only time he actually did something meaningful was his last story, Earthshock, and he dies at the end of it, which it's a bit of a shame, because it's like you actually started to get a bit interesting and then you get blown up at the end. So
yeah, it was bad timing in that sense, wasn't it, that he finally got to being a more interesting character. But yeah, I do think that Weekend with Waterhouse is probably my favorite feature on this box set. I just think it's that fascinating insight into him as a person. And I do think, like, having watched the season 19 Behind the Sofas, where you've got the TARDIS team of that season all together on one sofa or one sort of seat, I think, I don't know if I might have mentioned this before, but I just feel like Matthew C always seems so kind of on the outside of the group almost. Like, you know, there's very much the three of them dominating and they're all laughing at each other's jokes and whatever. And it feels like Matthew can barely even get a word in edgeways sometimes. Or when he does make a joke, they don't laugh at his jokes. And I just get that impression that, you know, he's kind of not sort of as part of the group as the rest of them. Maybe that was just the nature of, you know, the rest of them spending a lot more time together on the show. Maybe just not as popular and not getting on as well. I don't know. But I just thought that was really, really interesting. And as you say, actually his character was often more interesting in season 18, even with the difficult on-set relationships. Obviously, I guess Tom and Lala's failed marriage was probably one of the biggest problems being caught, or the whole situation with that going on through the season was probably one of the biggest problems, and them just being, I can imagine it just being a fairly awful working environment. And it must have been a bit crushing, particularly once he'd left the show, having, you know, been a fan his whole life, having had the opportunity of a lifetime, in many ways it not really always going that brilliantly, and then it suddenly being over. I can imagine that probably was quite, you know, tough to bounce back from, really. And so I think it's really nice that we get features like this to really just kind of celebrate him as a person, and actually he's got a really interesting perspective to tell, and as much as we maybe don't love his character, he can still try and convince us that it's a great character, even if we don't think so. But yeah, so that was Weekend with Waterhouse, one of the fantastic features on this box set, and definitely one of the ones I'd say is worth, you know, getting the box set for. Really, it really is that fascinating, I think. So we look through the next few stories. State of Decay hasn't really got too much in the way of new stuff on there either. I think there's a new commentary on there, but not a lot else. Then Warriors Gate, they give us a new 5.1 surround sound mix, which is just brilliant because it's got a bonkers, wacky soundtrack to Warriors Gate, along with the story being crazy. It's got a great soundtrack and great use of sound design as well, and so I think it really lends itself to a 5.1 soundtrack, and so I'd highly recommend, if you've even just got headphones, try watching it with that, because I think it sounds so much, it just sounds brilliant. You get so immersed into it. I think it's absolutely brilliant. But again, apart from that, there's not a huge amount new, nor actually is there on Keeper of Track, and they really do leave it till the final 2 discs to really bring in the new documentaries in the most part. So of course we'll come to that. We've got Logopolis, which one of the big features of it is the updated special effects. Ryan, I'm sure you've had a chance to watch some of these effects. Of course, they went to Jodrell Bank, which is where they were originally going to film the scenes of the satellite station, and ultimately obviously didn't. They used a model and so on and so forth, but that was the original plan. So finally, 35 years, 40 years later, they actually went there and did it, and we get to see what the show would look like if those were a part of it. How well do you think that actually worked, and how well was it integrated into the episodes themselves?
I thought it worked pretty effectively. I thought they did a good job of mirroring sort of the new effects in with the old ones, so it makes it feel similar while not detracting too much from the Fourth Doctor's last big heroic moment. I thought they did a good job of it. In a way, I feel like the new effects on Logopolis was exactly how I feel about the new effects on the following story, Castrovalva. I think like these new effects sort of added more to the stories, that maybe because of the fact that both these stories, both of which done by Christopher Hamilton Bidmead, was such big in concepts, I feel like they needed better effects to help support them. And I feel like these new effects for both these stories did work much more in its favour than probably did originally.
I've seen videos of like comparisons for all of the box sets that I haven't got, and yeah, I do think it's definitely one of the better updated special effects. Like for season 10, I don't think they're all that amazing, especially, you know, the ship and Planet of the Daleks and the like. But in season 18, I'd say they're the best integrated out of all of them. I'd say season 23 is quite good as well, but yeah.
Yeah, they definitely do a good job with this one. I think it really lends itself to it, and it really does actually add something. Because I guess I'm often more inclined to watch them as they were originally broadcast in that sense, and not always go down the special effects route. But I think in this particular occasion, it really does make a big difference to it and make it much more enjoyable. And so obviously they also decided to do a new making of documentary for this particular story, partially because the documentary which you mentioned, Charlie, A New Body at Last, is kind of much more about the overall kind of transition. So the last couple of stories of the season, the transition into Peter Davison, rather than purely on the making of the story itself. And so that's what we get explored in the making of Full of Copley. Nearly an hour long, in fact. And they visit the locations, I think, don't they? And go back there to sort of, you know, where the telescope was and everything, and use that as a sort of setting for the documentary, which is always nice. I felt like in some ways it was a fairly straightforward making of documentary, if that's not a negative way to put it. Like, not in that I thought it was bad in any way, just that it wasn't trying to be anything too different or unusual for a documentary. It very much was just quite lavish and flashy making of documentary, was my perspective. I don't know. What do you think, Ryan?
I thought it was an interesting documentary. It kind of felt like it went on a bit longer than perhaps it should have. I feel like it was, they were trying to drag it out in certain places. And kind of some of this information I did kind of already know, having looked through other DVD documentaries. Like some of this information like wasn't completely new to me. What was definitely fun, it was good seeing Janet Fielding talking about how she got cast as Teague, and that was something that I wanted, like how she got involved in casting, and also hearing sort of her perspective on Tegan, and was definitely interesting. I always feel like Tegan was of that early to mid 80s run, well, pretty much before Sophie Aldred's days, I thought Janet Fielding's Tegan was the best companion of the 80s, man, because I feel like there was more to her. And I actually feel like she was kind of almost like a prototype Donna Noble in a sense. That sort of more earthy character that wouldn't back down from an argument. I feel like that's kind of who Tegan was. What was really fascinating was her admitting that they weren't allowed to see the rushes just to see what their performances are like. It was basically do a take, that's it, move on to the next scene, and her feeling like that's not the way you should do it, and feel like if she had, and she feels like if she'd have watched the rushes, she might have gone back and maybe improved her performance or maybe done something different. So it was definitely interesting hearing her perspective, and also interesting hearing Sarah Sutton saying that because they were basically having to rush through the film into one scene's done, move on to the next one. For her, it felt like because of this, it didn't allow her to get her teeth into the character of Nyssa, which is probably why, for me, like, I could explain why Nyssa, Adric, maybe Turlo, and even, will admit, Peter Davison's Doctor never really sprung to life for me or connected with me personally, because I just never got the proper sense that these actors were given much to work with, or there wasn't that much to their characters in a way that perhaps there was a bit more with Tegan, I suppose.
Yeah, from what you were saying, Ryan, I think the Fifth Doctor never really came into his own until the Caves of Androzani, which is a bit late, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's rather a shame, isn't it, that it took his whole tenure for him to really become the Doctor we were all looking for. Maybe it's fair to say, but I guess it's the way it goes sometimes, isn't it? And I don't think for many people the Fifth Doctor is maybe our favourite Doctor, but maybe he's not the worst either. Somewhere in the middle, maybe, optimistically.
For me, controversially, I know some fans are probably going to freak out. He's probably my least favourite Doctor, which I think it was because of the fact that I just never really connected with him or got a sense of his Doctor, not until Caves of Androzani. I just feel like for a lot of his run, I just feel like I just got a sense of an actor playing the Doctor. I think that's just what the sense I got from Davison's Doctor, and I think that's probably why I never really connect with him, at least with someone like, say, Colin Baker or Jodie Whittaker, even though they perhaps didn't get the smoothest of runs. I just feel like I remembered them more. I feel like there was a bit more to them, whereas I feel like I didn't get that much with Davison, but that's a whole story for another time.
Well, exactly. I'm sure when we come around to some more Davison stories and whatever, then we can certainly have more of a discussion about that. But but coming back to, obviously we talked about the new making for Logopolis, and I think, as we say, one of the tricky parts was simply that it was covering some of the same ground that the other documentary was covering, and so if you watch both of those in fairly quick succession, it can give a feeling like you're just hearing a repeat of the same stuff, because there are fundamentally some of the same interviews being used in both of the stories, which in both the documentaries, which does make it a bit repetitive at points, I guess. But that's just kind of the nature of having sort of multiple documentaries from different releases all put onto the same release in the end. I think that can just have that impact naturally. So that's pretty much the main of the new stuff for Logopolis. And so we come to the final disc, which is sort of the K9 and Company disc, but also a few other bits and bobs on it as well. I know we kind of already covered the K9 and Company stuff, but obviously, as we said, it's got a behind the sofa for K9 and Company. There's the interview with Ian Sears, who played the character of Brendan. I think they do a fun little spoof version of the intro for K9 and Company as well, which is really fun because it's an iconic introduction, if nothing else. I don't know if you'd say it's good, but it is iconic.
It's legendary for Elizabeth Sladen's reactions alone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They are truly iconic. And so that covers off some most of the stuff for K9 and Company, because there's already a few features from the previous DVD release on there as well. And then the other kind of main new sort of feature that we get on here is the writer's room. And I think I'm right in saying this is the first time they did the writer's room feature, because they have done it since. I believe they've done it since. Was it on 20? Was it 23 or was it 26? They did it with after this. I can't actually remember.
I think it was with 23 they did it, because I think they were talking about the stories that they were going to do but didn't come through because of the hiatus that happened, and then it got restructured into the trial season.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, for people who don't know, the writer's room feature basically brings together the writers of various stories from whatever season. Obviously, with this one, season 18, they go down the pub and have a little chat about the episodes they wrote, what they think of each other's episodes, how they all came together, and all of that essentially. So obviously, we got Christopher Bidmead, who wrote Logopolis, that's the word I was looking for, Logopolis. Andrew Smith, who wrote Full Circle, Stephen Gallagher, who did Warriors Gate, and John Flanagan, who was one half of Meglos, I believe. Did I get that right, guys? I think I got that right. Nailed it. And obviously they all sit down and have a really nice chat about their different stories. And I think it's really nice to get that perspective, as much as, obviously some of them haven't gone back and watched the stories particularly recently and are just kind of remembering from the time what they thought of it, I think. But I think it's still just a really nice to get sort of everybody, sort of different writers who are involved in completely different stories, but around that same time, being able to discuss the different production kind of problems they faced, I guess. There's the scripting problems they faced. Obviously, this series, introduces 3 new companions through the season. And so there was that challenge that was sort of factored into it and able to discuss as well. So I thought that it gave just a really, a slightly different perspective to what the making ofs give you, because they usually interview each of those writers, but only individually. And so they're very much just talking about their own story. Oh yeah, I had this idea, I did this because, oh yeah, they wouldn't let me do this, blah 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 blah. And it's interesting, it's great insight, but I think having them being able to bounce it off with other writers and getting they really sort of like appreciate each other. I think they love to kind of, it's quite a positive and quite a praiseworthy sort of session almost for them. They're all like, oh yeah, your story was great, no, I really enjoyed it, it was lovely. And it just feels like there's a great camaraderie between them. I think is really sort of great to see that is still there all these years later. Ryan, what was your sort of thoughts and your take on this particular feature?
Exactly the same as you, Elliot. I thought it was definitely a good sort of chat between this selection of writers and hearing all the different thoughts. It was interesting hearing that Andrew Smith wrote Full Circle, and I believe he was only about 17, which is frankly amazing. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to write a story about nearly half as good at the age of 17, but which is why I'm probably a bit more softer towards Full Circle, because I'm frankly amazed at the fact that he managed to get what is a competent story out at the age of 17. I just think that was definitely commendable. And also hearing Stephen Gallagher talking about how his opinion on the final product of Warriors Gate, how he feels very up and down towards it. Like he does like that they managed to get his ideas across, but yet he's also still kind of miffed that he feel like he's still kind of a bit watered down because of the fact that they had to translate it to screen, and as well as the fact that his dialogue got rewritten. So it was definitely interesting hearing from him. What really surprised me was that Christopher Hamilton Bidmead is not a fan of State of Decay, because he's not a fan of the Hammer horror elements, and thought it was against what he was going for with the season, which was definitely a bit surprising, considering that I feel like State of Decay is one of, if not the best story of the season.
Yeah, exactly. It was quite surprising. I guess that's just not what his vision of what he wanted Doctor Who to be in that season, because of course he was basically the script editor for at least half the season, I think. And so I guess that was kind of one that you got the impression it was one of those old, oh, I've been lumped with this script, I've got to produce it even though I don't really like it very much. And it's obviously just a shame that it was Terence who'd wrote that. And watching that documentary, it was only a few months, of course, before he passed away, was that documentary was released. I think it was it August 19, and this was released in February. So obviously Terence was still with us when they put that all together. But yeah, it was a bit of a shame that he seemed to have quite a negative perception on it. But it's also interesting you mentioned about Stephen Gallagher and his thoughts on Warrior's Gate. It's quite fun watching the different features, some of the ones that were done like sort of 10, 12 years ago compared to the more recent ones, and it feels like you see that kind of change in perspective that he's talking about, where 12 years ago on the original sort of making of, he's very critical of a lot of it and what he's sort of the outcome of it and everything, whereas I feel like now he's a lot mellowed that bit more. And I think that's just the fun thing with these Blu-rays and almost having a second go around with a lot of these stories. It's sort of like you're given these writers or the actors or whatever another 10 or 15 years to kind of think about or sort of change their opinions almost on some of these stories or the situations they were in and stuff. I think that's just a reminder of some of these great opportunities we get with the Blu-rays of being able to do things like that. So I think that's really, really cool, really there. So yeah, that pretty much covers most of the new stuff on it, really. There's the usual sort of, convention footage and archive interviews and obviously the Blu-ray trailers on there and all those kind of things, the PDF content and all of that. But overall, I think season 18 is a very decent release. I feel like it's one of those where there was simply quite a lot already done on the DVD range, that it didn't necessarily need as much new content to kind of create it into a full box set. You feel like there's quite a lot there, and also there were 7 stories plus K9 and Company. So in terms of pure episode content, there's already quite a lot on there for a box set compared to, say, season 24, where there's only 14 episodes at all to be able to talk about, and then they've got to really fill it with a lot of other features as well, particularly with the popularity of it. So I don't know, Charlie, obviously you haven't been able to get the Blu-rays, but looking at it overall from the DVD range and the stories themselves, what's your overall perspective on season 18?
It's very much a mixed bag. Like I didn't actually mind Ledger Hive that much. I can't remember much of Megalos, but I did actually really like State of Decay and Keeper of Traken, and the rest, like Full Circle, I do quite like, because the writer of it wasn't too far from my age when he wrote it, and I think that's really impressive. And Warriors Gate is absolutely mental, and Legopolis, like you were saying, it's fine. But it's not the send off that Tom Baker deserves. But overall, I do quite like the hard sci-fi elements, the new direction that JNT was taking the show in, the new score as well. The soundtrack's fantastic, and just generally, it's a well-deserved reboot.
Exactly. Yes, Ryan, what's your overall perspective on season 18 and looking at the Blu-ray as well?
In terms of season 18, I do think it was a solid season. I wouldn't say it's Tom's best one. I mean, it doesn't reach the heights of those first 3 seasons of his with the Golden Age, and even the Key to Time season. I don't think it quite reached that, but I still think it was a pretty solid season. I think there was definitely more good stories. I feel like the only story that I didn't really engage with was Megalos, but I think that was pretty much about it. I do think it was a solid season. And I do think that and the last 2 seasons, 25 and 26, were definitely the strongest story seasons of the 80s, definitely for me. So the beginning and the end. So, which shows that for me there was definitely a mixed bag of white noise in between. So yeah, I think it was a solid season, and so the fact that it's got a Blu-ray release, I was obviously going to be excited about it. And I think they did a pretty solid job with what they did manage to put towards it, even if I did think that maybe certain documentaries were stretched out far longer than perhaps they should have been.
Yeah, exactly. I think overall it's a solid season. Solid in the most part, as we say. A very decent box set. I mean, I don't think there's any bad collection box sets. Maybe this is one of the just one with less opportunity to enhance it, if nothing else, I think. And so it's still a very good release, and certainly if you haven't got all the DVDs, it's 100% worth it. but maybe there are ones that have got more new content on than this one, for example. But that pretty much brings us to the end of season 18. So of course we next move on to our other box set of discussion today, season 10, the fourth John Pertwee season out of 5, the final one for Katie Manning's character of Joe Grant as well, featuring 5 stories. A part of course, one of mine, I think Ryan's personal favourite eras of the show, in the John Pertwee era. So this is very much an area of Doctor Who we love to have a little chat about. But Charlie, what's your perspective on season 10 as a season and the stories?
Honestly, I love season 10. I'd say it's up there in the top 5 seasons, I'd say, up there with 16, 14, 7, 8, those sort of seasons. I really do enjoy it. I think the only real weak point was Planet of the Daleks, and even that was passable, but like 3 Doctors, Frontier in Space, Green Death were all phenomenal stories. And when I go to collect the collection box sets that have already been, I'm prioritizing this one, I'd say.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, season 10 is a fantastic season of Doctor Who. As you say, there's no bad stories there. Planet of the Daleks is the least good one. And yes, it is a rehash of probably bits of every single Dalek story that's been in the past up to that point, but it's still not bad. And all the other 4 stories are pretty fantastic, I think, personally. Ryan, what's your take on the other these stories?
Yeah, I think this is a consistently strong season. I think Pertwee with season 7, 8, and this, I think he had 3 good, strong seasons, absolutely. And as I said, I agree, Planet of the Daleks is probably the weakest one, but as I still had a fun time with it, and especially compared to something like Death to the Daleks, it's definitely a step above that story. And I did enjoy Carnival of Monsters and like the idea of them being trapped inside like a monster miniaturizing machine. I think that's such a fascinating concept, and it was interesting to see that idea got reintroduced in a Doctor Who live show back in 2010 when Matt Smith's first year. They had the grandson of the inventor of that machine be the main character in that show. So it was interesting to see them sort of use this story as kind of a template for that, and it just goes to show what an entertaining story that was. And as I said, Frontier in Space I think is solid, even though I did feel like the middle chunk of it where the Doctor gets, when they keep getting recaptured, get sent to prison, and that whole middle chunk with the Doctor in that prison didn't really need to be there for me personally. But other than that, I thought it was an interesting story about with the Master and the Ogrons trying to initiate this war between Earth and Draconia. I thought it was definitely a fascinating idea, pretty solid story, and obviously both the 3 Doctors and Green Death are just phenomenal stories. I absolutely love them. I think they're some of the best of the 70s, definitely.
Yeah, and you pretty much summed up my opinions. I think Green Death in particular is a proper top tier Doctor Who story. It feels like one of the sort of pinnacles of the Unit era of Doctor Who, really. You've got all of the iconic characters of the Unit era, of the Brigadier, of Sergeant Benton, of Captain Yates, of Joe Grant and the Third Doctor, and everybody, all a part of it, firing all cylinders. I think it's such a phenomenal story to end the series on, and just the perfect conclusion for Joe as a character as well. I think it's absolutely fantastic. But of course, we're here, to talk about the Blu-ray as well. And so one of the first things I actually wanted to talk about was the behind the sofas for this one. I know we obviously mention them every time, but I just thought in particular, one of the notable things with this box set is that the behind the sofas are quite long. Most of them are like 45 minutes to an hour long. I think the Green Death one is pretty much an hour long, ultimately, which is maybe a little bit too long, because on most of the other box sets they're much closer to half an hour, and I think that probably is generally a better length for them. But just the interesting thing I found for me was again the good old second sofa, as we were discussing, which features Phil Collinson, Pete McTighe, and Joe Wilkinson. Of course, Phil Collinson, producer from the RTD era, and Pete McTighe and Joe Wilkinson being writers from Series 11, and I think Pete did Series 12 as well. So sort of people who are very New Who centric and involved in New Who, being able to go back and watch these classic Who stories, particularly for, I think it was Phil Collinson who watched these as a child and was going back to them. I think that was a great, really fun perspective. And obviously up until season 8, we didn't really get any other New Who sort of people having a perspective on the classic series through the behind the sofa features. I don't think I'll miss anybody else out. So I think this was just one of those fascinating opportunities to get that different perspective again. I mean, Ryan, what was your take from it on the behind the sofas you did get to watch?
I thought it was definitely an interesting item. Definitely a shake-up, which I feel like it kind of needed, so to have a bit more different perspectives. And the fact that they got in sort of new writers, new from and producers from Modern Doctor Who, does hopefully give me a bit of hope that maybe they might do this if they ever decide to do Modern Doctor Who for the Blu-ray collection range. Hopefully, and maybe they could do a reverse idea, like have the modern people be the main sofa while the backup sofa be the classic
Exactly.
cast. I think that would have been a good, interesting idea. But yeah, it was definitely a good lineup, particularly for this season. And I did, as I felt like it was kind of interesting that they stretched out the behind the sofa for the Green Death. I think it was because of the fact that it was Joe's last story, that perhaps they wanted to give it that big, more momentous behind the sofa that story needed. And of course, seeing Katie, Richard, and John getting emotional at Joe's farewell, which is frankly one of the best companion exits ever. It was definitely a good note to go out on, and then recollecting their memories and how fond they still are of each other. It definitely kind of made that extra length worth it in the end, I feel, for me.
Yeah, 100%. I think it gave a great extra, just extra opportunity to give a perspective. I think some of the behind the sofas were maybe a little bit overly long, and I think in general it's better to stick close to half an hour. But some of those really important stories with important moments, I think it's good to give that extra opportunity just for the original cast really to give their perspective on what it was like filming what were some very challenging scenes at time is probably the best way to describe it. So one of the other big features on the Three Doctors disc, just looking at that as it's the first one up, was the Looking for Lenny feature, which again features Toby Haydock and is one of another one of these fascinating Chris Chapman documentaries where they basically go in search for information about someone involved in Doctor Who we really know nothing about. This is, of course, Lenny Mayne, who directed this story, and I think he directed a couple of other Doctor Who's as well. I can't remember which ones, but I'm pretty sure he directed something else.
I think he also did Monster of Peladon, and I think he also did.
Yes.
I think he definitely did do Hand of Fear. He definitely did Hand of Fear.
Yes, but he directed a few Doctor Who stories, and I think he then he kind of disappeared off the radar. I think then passed away, and so we very much sort of, for the last 30 years, there's been no real information about who he really was, what, where he came from, his family, anything really. And so this is a feature that sort of is a spin-off of a feature Looking for Peter, I think it was called, back on the Sensorites DVD, I believe it was, when they were looking for Peter R. Newman, who I think was the writer of or maybe the director, I can't remember, one or the other of the Sensorites. I really should be better at my Doctor Who knowledge here, shouldn't I? But it's fine. And so, Toby Haydock basically goes on a mission trying to find people and meet people to try and find out information about this chap who died 30 years ago and we know nothing about. And I just found this documentary both fascinating and also kind of just finding quite a sad story really in the way he passed away, and seeing, I think there's this sort of suitcase, wasn't there, that hadn't been opened for 30 years or something, that's still an original suitcase that he'd packed, and just fascinating little things like that. I thought, it really gave us some information and a fascinating perspective on somebody we really knew nothing about before. Ryan, I don't know, did you get a chance to watch this? What did you think of it?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I definitely think it was a fascinating insight into a director that we didn't really know that much about, and that seemed pretty much mysterious up until then. And it is really sad that you have a man who loved the water, who loved the ocean, and would tragically be the end of him, and how he fell into the ocean and his body was never recovered, and it was really sad. And also it was definitely great also to hear like other people's perspective, like Andrew Morgan, who was another Doctor Who director, talking about him, Bernard Cribbins turning up, speaking about his experiences with him, and hearing all the different points of view, also from his daughter as well. It was definitely a fascinating insight, and how they explained, like, he used his sort of background as a dancer and a choreographer, and how he used that in relation to camera movements and camera techniques. I definitely think it was definitely a fascinating insight.
Yeah, exactly. As you say, it was a tragic story of his death ultimately, and I think that these documentaries have such a gentle way of going about telling a very tragic story. Ultimately, of giving us the positives, the joy that his life was, and the things that he did, and as you say, the sort of attitudes and ideas he brought into Doctor Who and directing it, and directing one of the most significant stories in the show in the Three Doctors. It was the first multi-Doctor story, the first anniversary special. It was a huge story for Doctor Who to do that, and he was the man behind it. And so the fact he got that opportunity, I think, was absolutely brilliant. And as we say, this documentary just really brings that out and brings out the person that he was. So I think it's one of those documentaries that probably only appeals to a very small amount of people, us and obsessive Doctor Who fans. But actually watching it, it's fascinating. We really get that new piece of insight. It's not just the same old anecdotes from Katie Manning that we've all heard before. It's actually something new and fresh on a documentary, and I think that's absolutely brilliant personally. So that kind of covers off the Three Doctors disc. I don't think there's anything else particularly new on that particular disc. Just some of the same stuff that was on the previous special edition. There, and then again, it's fairly similar on Carnival of Monsters, apart from the new Behind the Sofa. There's sort of various other stuff. There's the early edit for episode 2, I think, as well, which had a couple of extra deleted scenes in it, but that was also previously on the special edition. Because it's worth noting that both the Three Doctors and Carnival of Monsters both got a sort of special edition release as well as the original DVD release, so they were already pretty well stocked on special features when it came to it. I mean, Charlie, what was your perspective on some of the sort of DVD special features? Because I know those in particular had a lot of stuff on them previously.
Yeah, there was one for Three Doctor Special Edition, and it was called like was Doctor Who rubbish or something like that, and it was sort of defending the often maligned parts of it, like the bad special effects, the filming in quarries, and that sort of stuff. And I just thought it was quite funny them sort of defending even some really bad and like glaring flaws in it. Like you can just admit that it's not perfect. But yeah, I thought that was quite amusing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, unfortunately, that has been actually removed from this particular box set once it went over to the Blu-rays. I think they're looking to put it on, like the Wilderness Years or something. I don't know quite where it'll end up, but I certainly watched it back on the DVD range, and it was a really just a fun, kind of light-hearted, heartwarming look at the show, and going, yeah, sure, there are wobbly sets, there were terrible pieces of set and whatever, and yeah, they're all the planets were quarries, but we love it. It's great. It's Doctor Who, and we're not going to in any way be negative about that. And so I think it's kind of once you get past that and accept some of the shortcomings in that sense, you can just Doctor Who was never rubbish. It's always been a great show for so many different reasons, and it's great to have those sort of fun looks back at it that really can just bring out some of the positivity of it. I think that's really, really great. So yeah, we come through Carnival Monsters, and then we move on to Frontier in Space, which again I don't think it has huge amounts new to it. Obviously the Behind the Sofa covering it off again. And it also reintroduces the Pertwee Years little introduction to the final episode as well, the old Pertwee Years VHS box set, where he recorded various introductions to sort of individual episodes that were included within that VHS release. So that's just a fun little archive feature that I don't think has been on anything since the VHS days. And then there's also, I don't know, actually, Charlie, you probably have if you've seen Frontier in Space and Planet of the Lights, you've probably watched these really quite odd two-part making of documentary called The Perfect Scenario, which sort of has a whole sort of storyline, and they're like, we're educating us on like sort of culture and politics of the time alongside the stories in a really weird way. I don't know, did you manage to watch these?
I honestly I haven't watched them in my rewatch recently,
Yeah.
but I think I do vaguely like being really confused at a documentary, like have I accidentally changed the source and put this other channel on? Because it's just the most niche, weird documentary I think I've ever seen. Like, is this Doctor Who anymore?
Yeah, I think it sort of brings us like they're on some weird planet or something, and they're inside some sort of matrix database type thing, looking at 1970s Earth to learn something, and then using Frontier in Space and Planet of the Daleks and comparing it to current political situations and social situations and stuff. It's wholly bizarre. I guess it was like they were trying to just make a making of that's a bit more quirky and interesting, but I don't know. I don't think it really added to anything too much. I mean, Ryan, have you ever seen these ones?
I haven't checked this one out, but definitely hearing from you guys, I think it does sound actually kind of fascinating to watch just to see what it's like.
I mean, yeah, it's certainly very unusual. I mean, it's an hour of your life because there's it's a half an hour on Frontier in Space and half an hour on Planet of the Daleks. They were obviously released on the DVDs together. And so it's sort of a two-part making of that kind of crosses over. And yeah, there is some good. Well, it's sort of a making of because I think there was separate making of documentaries on there as well. So it wasn't meant to be the primary making of. It was more of a, as I say, a cultural, social look at the story and its connections to the real world. Which I'm sure, yeah, stories like Frontier in Space kind of did have a lots of kind of cut, and the Pertwee Year in general had a lot of stuff talking about sort of real world issues within the story, and you think of the Green Death and stories like that, and covering those things off. I think that can be quite interesting, but yeah, maybe in these features was a little bit too far, shall we say. So we come along to Planet of the Daleks. That's the next new thing, a next story up there with something new. I think Charlie, you mentioned this briefly earlier, was the special effects they did for Planet of the Daleks, which unfortunately are probably, as you say, some of the weaker stuff they've done in terms of VFX. I mean, I know you said you watched the comparisons. What was your sort of thoughts on it?
For the most part, like there wasn't a whole lot in Planet of the Daleks really, compared to some of the other stories, like in other box sets such as Terror of the Autons or something. But for Planet of the Daleks, like the ship, the Supreme or Emperor Dalek, or whatever, the Supreme Dalek ship, landing down, looks almost as bad as the original. I think, like I'd rather it look too practical than too fake in CGI.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ryan, have you watched it with the special effects?
Yeah, I only watched it once, and I didn't feel like it really improved that much in comparison to, say, like Logopolis or Castrovalva. I just feel like it was just sort of an addition, a neat little addition, but that's all it is, really. I just didn't feel like, as I said, it added much to the story that it was already there before.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the weaker ones. Maybe they just had less money left to spend on it. Maybe that was what the problem was this time round. But I don't think it's one of those versions that I'll really be rushing back to too often. But then we come to the Green Death, the final story of the season. One of the main new features on this particular disc was the Keeping Up with the Joneses feature, which saw Casey Manning and Stuart Bevan go back to some of the locations of the Green Death, go and meet some of the people who were there on the filming days. I think there was a couple of kids who sort of bunked off school to go and watch the filming or something, I remember, which was quite a fun little moment, talking to them. And, I can't imagine, those kids ever thought they'd suddenly be interviewed on a documentary about Doctor Who because they bunked off school to go and watch it being filmed for a day. But it's just that kind of feeling for these small sort of towns where Doctor Who rocked up for a few weeks 40 years ago. It was a huge deal because they all still remember it. They all still remember being a part of it. And I just think it's so fun to watch and to hear that and to see those perspectives. Ryan, what did you take from this particular documentary?
I thought it was a fun little documentary. Seeing Katie Manning and Stuart Bevan together again, riding around in Bessie, going to all the different locations, and how much it has changed since they filmed in 1973, and especially how they go to the mines, where that major place where the mines, I think it was called the Ogilvie Mines, I believe it was called. It might be
something like that, yeah.
And just how it's now just nothing but Greenland, and there's only little tiny parts that remained, built as sort of like a shrine to sort of respect the place as it used to be. And the fact that it got shut down only 2 years later, and just seeing how emotional sort of Katie got because of that, because that was the location that she remembered the most. It was definitely interesting to see them going back and see how much has changed since then.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, and we obviously got a similar thing on the season 8 box set when they went back to Devil's End as well. That was sort of the spin-off of the sequel to this, shall we say, as well, which is really nice. And hopefully, maybe we'll get an opportunity on another Pertwee season to have another one of these, depending on what story I guess they choose to cover with it. But it could be quite interesting as well. So that was a really fun new feature I think they got to introduce on that. Then, of course, we come to the bonus disc and the last few new features on there. Probably my personal favourite feature of the whole box set, the very, very feature-length Doctor Who and the Third Man, which is basically a sort of retrospective documentary looking at the whole Jon Pertwee era, essentially. with Matthew Sweet as the sort of host of it, set wasn't it the house where the Three Doctors was filmed? Was it there they did it? Yeah, exactly. And so that's a great location to start with to be able to do it from. And well, one of the things that I thought was particularly brilliant about it was they had Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, of course, to come and chat about it as well, because so seldom on some of the more recent Doctor Who documentaries have we actually had New Who sort of, writers and people involved in the show come and talk about the classic series. But both of them have always talked about how much they love the third Doctor era, particularly Mark Gatiss. And so obviously it was an obvious choice to get them on there. And I think it helped to just give a really interesting perspective on that whole era. And, the way that season 7 was so dark and how that just couldn't have continued through later seasons. Otherwise the show would have just become way too bleak. But actually that season itself is just brilliant. And they agree with that sort of perspective as well, I think is fantastic. So Ryan, what was your take on Doctor Who and the Third Man?
It's definitely, I agree with you, it's absolutely my favourite feature of the season. It was definitely interesting to see how the Pertwee era, how the consensus, the idea behind it came about, how Derek Sherwin feeling like he wasn't a fan of how there were so many outer space stories and feel like it needed a change, and how he wanted to make it so much like Quatermass, and that he wanted it to be confined to Earth to make it feel more grounded, which is why UNIT was created in the first place. And it was so interesting to see that after he brought it to life with Spearhead from Space, he immediately left afterwards and left everything in Barry Letts and Terrence Dick's hands, which, from what I understand, it made John Pertwee angry to begin with. It's like, you brought me in and then you suddenly leave. And so, but then again, it proved to be a blessing, because putting John Pertwee along with Barry Letts and Terrence Dicks, it produced one of the best eras of the show's history, and how they do start off within that sort of mold, and how each season feels different in the Pertwee era. They always shake it up, which I think shows why the Pertwee era is so amazing, is the fact that each season feels different. And you see Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss talking about how it evolves and transitions into each season, and hearing Stephen Moffat's perspective on just like who the Doctor is. And he makes a great comment about how it feel like with the Pertwee season, it was the first time the Doctor was properly the central hero of the show, because beforehand, with William Hartnell, even though he was the Doctor, he wasn't like the central hero in, say, like Ian Chesterton. And it was the same with Patrick Chan, because Jamie was there to do the fight scenes and all that. But with the Pertwee era, Moffat observed definitely was the fact that if there's a big chase sequence, the Doctor's at the center of it. He's the center of the fight scenes. He's the center of the peril. It hasn't changed since then. And he's absolutely right. Ever since then, it's always the Doctor's at the center of the action, and he's always there. And watching this documentary, it just makes me miss Stephen Moffat's passion for the show. As I was rewatch it again recently, I just thought to myself, man, I just really miss Moffat talking passionately about Doctor Who. It's just something I sorely miss nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. I think that Stephen is definitely one of the highlights of the documentary, and he's got such a fascinating perspective on the Doctor, what the character should be, what the show should be. He had such a real vision for that, and that it was influenced by so many different eras of the past as well, which I think was just absolutely fascinating, and as you say, was really brought out in this documentary as well. And so that pretty much brings us to the conclusion of the season 10 box set. There's also an omnibus version of The Green Death, I think, which was aired in the late 70s, which is on there if people are interested in it. I haven't actually personally watched it, but I know that there are sort of people who, watched it at the time that are really interested in those kind of things. And it's great that they kind of have all these different sort of things on there just for people to be able to enjoy, alongside lots of archive stuff. And even The Death of the Doctor, the Sarah Jane story as well, because of course it included Katie Manning in there. That's on the final disc alongside everything else. So that pretty much covers off season 10. We're running out of time, so we'll wrap this up reasonably quickly. But yeah, I mean, overall, guys, do you think season 10 is a top quality season of Doctor Who, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think, as I said, it ranks alongside season 7 and 8 as the best of the John Pertwee era, and I think they did such a good job with this box set and highlighting just how special that season and especially the whole John Pertwee era is. Absolutely.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Ryan. Season 10 is just amazing. While last time I said season 11 wasn't great, but yeah, I do really, really enjoy season 10. It does not have a bad episode. It's just everything is running at full cylinders, and I think it makes my top 5, if not definitely my top 10.
Exactly that. Yeah, it really is probably one of the best seasons of Doctor Who that, well, at very least one of the best ones that's been released so far, if nothing else. And I'm sure there's many great seasons to come as well. So that pretty much covers us for season 10 and season 18 of the classic series. Of course, their re-releases are available to purchase now. We've got The Web of Fear coming up next month. The animation is coming on the 16th of August, and then Evil of the Daleks on the 27th of September. So 2 brand new animations to look forward to very soon. And on the next podcast, of course, we're going to be talking about another animation, and, well, ultimately became an animation. It's going to be our Sharda special edition, because there's been about 10 different versions of Sharda. We're going to talk about them all, so you know exactly what they are, why they were made, when they happened, and what for. But that's about it from this edition of KerVAM. We will see you again very soon. Goodbye.